How's it going, boys? We're back at it again, and today we're going to be making a very special video. Are you one of those people that doesn't do any damage in PvP? Doesn't matter how many times you hit the enemy, you always do very little, and then you get hit and you get chunked? Well, it's not your fault. The information is just not there, to the public. It's not very easy. People are not introduced to it, but there is an insane amount of borrow power in the game, and this video will hopefully make you understand better why is it that you're not doing damage. We're gonna break down this video into 3 categories. First, we're going to be talking about general gear, right? Like, what is the difference between 700 and 725? Then we're going to be talking about borrow powered and consumables. That is going to be the biggest clump of damage that you're missing. And then we're going to be playing, well, we're going to be talking about the build that you're playing, essentially, because every build has its way of doing damage with a rotation or some sort of empowerment that the build has. Well, without making the intro any longer, let's go ahead and start talking about it. The first thing that we are going to be talking about, it is going to be the gear, right? This is a incredible misconception that people think that all that matters is the gear score, like 725, and they think like, well, if I'm not 725, I will never win a fight. I am in such a huge disadvantage that will never win a fight unless that I'm 725. And actually, that is not the case whatsoever. To give you, a breakdown, like super fast, the damage difference between a full 700 and 725, it's about 15%, 1.5, give or take. It's a little bit more and a little bit less depending on the class or the build or the weapon that you're playing with. But it usually, average at around 15% more damage and at about 10% more defenses, right? That is the entire difference right there between a 700 and 725 gear score. Now, obviously, that is not a lot. So that is not the actual reason why you are losing the fights. It's of course a factor, and it's not a factor that I'm gonna throw out the window, but a 15% damage differential and a 10% protection differential is not the main impact or the main reason why you're losing these fights, especially if the enemy it's like 90, 70, even above 50% health by the time you die. When you combine the increment in gear score and whenever you combine the increments in the perk, it is very, very little the difference. The major difference when it comes to 700 and 725, it actually comes from the attributes. 700 has 4 attributes less than 725, and that 40 extra attribute, that is where the major difference comes in when we're talking about the gear, simply because that 40 extra attribute points can get you some new ATVs or ATVs that you didn't have before that can give you that extra 5-10% that you needed. For those of you that don't know what ATVs are the little bubbles in the attributes. And with that 44 extra attribute points, you can, for example, if you're like a bow player, you can get to that 50 strength and then get 10% more damage on your heavy attacks. Or maybe you can put 50 points into intelligence, which now you get 5% extra damage on an enemy that is, afflicted by a dot, and 5% extra critical damage. So this is where most of the difference is gonna come in, right? When we're talking about the difference in gear. So now that we have the gear out of the way, and we already established that this is not the main reason why you're losing. But again, it still is a factor, but it's only 15% damage increase and about 10% damage mitigation. That is it. That is all you get for the gear. Now let's talk about the next one on why is it that you might not be doing as much damage as a veteran. Now, since we're talking that the gear is about 15%, the damage difference between a veteran and a casual player or a new player that just got to level 65, the damage difference between these two is actually more than 40-50%. Yes, more than 40-50%. It is pretty big. So the reason you're dying to a level, to a veteran, even though you're 65, is not because they have a better gear than you, okay? Because like I said, the gear is only about 15%. So where are they getting this extra 45% increased damage than they have, then you don't have? And well, that is where borrow power and consumable is gonna come in. For example, if you are a new player and you just got to level 65, you most likely not gonna have 700 gear scored, and you know, even less 725. But let's say that you have 725 gear scored, right? So you are the same power level, right, as a veteran player, but the thing is that you are not. For example, if you are a mage class, there are these things that are called glass gems, and these glass gems, they're going to give you 2% more elemental damage to whatever elemental damage build you are building. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is because this is something that a newer player won't be able to afford. This is something that the veteran player can afford, not a newer player. So 15% damage difference just from 7 to 725. But then you can get 10% from the gem. These gems are expensive. This is something that I recommend people to do at the very last, because you put these things once you have found that piece of item that you are looking for, right? So the glass gem is something that is not recommended for a shitty piece of gear. It's for a beast piece of gear. Why? Because they're expensive. They're 3,000 to 5,000 gold each in one of these. So a veteran player will already have 10 extra % more damage just with the gems alone, right, than a newer player. So we're talking about 15% plus 10% damage here. Also, as a newer player, you probably and most likely won't have a damage ring. Every single person in this game should be using a damage ring that is corresponded to your build. If you use Fire Staff and Blunt the Boss, then fire damage. If you use Void Gauntlet and like Abyss, then void damage. If you use Sword and Shield and Hatchet, then slash damage. So there is a damage type for basically every single one of the builds out there. And as a new player, you probably don't have that. Also, that's another thing that you should be putting there. Before we continue talking about empowerments, I would like to tell you guys that empowerment has a cap of 50%, okay? And every single veteran player aims to have close to that 50% empowerment, so they're always doing 50% more damage, 40 to 50% more, which again, a newer player does not know about empowerment. It does not know, they don't know anything about this. Every veteran knows about the 50% empower cap. So every time they're building a build, they are adding up all of the empowerment so they can get very close to that 50%. For example, the ring, it is 7%. The gems, that is another 10%. So now we're talking about 17% in power. So somehow, some way, I still have room for an extra 33% empowerment. And where am I gonna get that from, right? So that is the goal, trying to get as close as to that 50% empowerment as possible. So again, what does the veteran player has over you? He has that 10% increase in damage from gems. He has 7 to 8% damage increase on the ring, right? That right there is something that they have by just having more money and time. As a newer player, you're not going to have a damage ring. That is something that you're going to get later on. Very easy to obtain, but you just didn't know about it, right? Because the game doesn't really tell you. So from the gems and the ring, that is right there, 17%. But now let's talk about consumables. Honing Stone. This is probably something that you guys are not aware of. There is a consumable in the game that gives you damage, and there is consumables in the game that gives you damage absorption, all right? Every veteran is using a Honing Stone, a powerful Honing Stone, the one that gives you 7% increased damage. So whenever you add it to the ring and the gems, now we're talking about 24% increased damage. And that is without anything, well, using this thing, but you don't have to like attack or do anything. That is just 24% passive damage increase right there. This is already more damage increase than the gear difference, right? The ring and the Honing Stone is already the same damage than the gear difference does. And that is exactly why I want you guys to not emphasize too much on that 725 gear score, because I myself, you know, as a veteran player, I still use 700 gear score. It's 700 here, 700 here, 700 here, you know, 700 here. The artifacts, of course, 725 because they're easy to upgrade. But as you guys can see, a veteran like myself that has a very good success in PvP, I still utilize 700. Why? Because again, the difference between 700 and 725 is very little. Most of the difference comes from the other thing. But let's go ahead and continue talking about the consumables. So this is for damage. Now let's talk about protection, because the same way that you are doing very little damage to them, it's not because, well, not only are you missing all of this damage increase right here, but also they have damage reduction. Where do they get this damage reduction from? The first one we're going to talk about, which I think is the most powerful one, is going to be the Desert Sunrise. This is a drink, like a food that you consume, and it will last 1 hour. And what this do is all of the damage over time effects that you have on you are reduced by 25%. Once again, this is not something the game tells you. This is something that you have to find out 100% on your own. So when it comes to defensive consumables, we have the Desert Sunrise, 25% mitigation to dots. If you have a dot build, this thing right here is an insane counter to it. And not just a dot build. Basically every weapon in the game has some sort of dots, or they have keenly jagged. So having Desert Sunrise will protect you by 25% from every single dot in the game. Something that you are either not using because these are expensive, or simply because you didn't know about. Now, the second consumable we're going to be talking about, oh, by the way, the food, remember the food comes in different categories. You have the 40 attributes, you have 44, and you have 48. Remember that it's a good idea to have the 48 attribute foods inside of your inventory for whenever you go into one of the activities like arenas and capture the flag, so you can consume the best of the consumables. And the other consumables that I'm going to be talking about is going to be the gemstone dust, the oak flesh bomb, and then the absorption potions, right? Let's start with this too. This is the protection, a general protection for all magical abilities and all magical damage. This is a general protection for all physical abilities and physical damage. It says right there, increases absorption of physical damage type by 35% for 20 seconds, or until you have received 15 types, 15 hits. It doesn't matter, 15 types of damage. It says 35%, but it's not really 35%. Okay, that is fortification. Okay, so that is 35% increase to physical armor. Okay, not 35% physical damage absorption. This is 35% increase to your physical armor, and this is 35% increase to your magical armor. Once again, so meaning is, if you're like a light player, these are not really strong for you. If you are a heavier player, this will be stronger, or if you're a medium. But once again, this one only lasts 20 seconds and is until 15 hits, until you receive 15 hits. So when do you use this one? Well, you will use this one whenever there is a generalized, magical builds that is not just a specific one. And this one you will use it whenever you're fighting anybody that is physical damage. You will always use this one whenever you're fighting against somebody that is physical damage, because unfortunately there is not a elemental absorption potion for physical damage, only for elements. And this is the last consumable that I'm going to talk about when it comes to the things that you have access to. This is the infused absorption potion. This one over here says that it absorbs 15% of a specific element for 30 seconds. It doesn't matter how many times you get hit. This 15%, it is 15% damage absorption of that specific element. So 15% damage reduction of fire, ice, void, whatever one of these potions you have. These ones are incredibly powerful whenever you're fighting against somebody that is using a magical build, right? So yes, those are the general consumables that we have right here. Obviously in OPR, in wars, you're going to have the cleansing consumable, which it gets rid of all of the dots, but I'm not gonna talk about that. So now that we have talked about the difference in gear, right? 775, which is about 15% damage, 10% absorption. Then we also talk about borrow power. Borrow power is the things like consumables and the passive things that you put in your gear. So an extra 10% from here. So we're talking about now like 25% damage increase. Then the ring over here, we're talking about 32% damage increase. Then we're talking about the honing stone, that is another 7%. We're talking about 39 percent increase or 30% increase in damage, right? Just from having these things. And they could potentially have anywhere between, well, 15% with these potions and the 10% from the gear. You know, you can about 25 to 30% more damage absorption than you do. Okay, and while we're talking about damage absorption, let's go ahead and talk about pre-potting. This is something that the veterans do pretty much every single time they're gonna go into battle. And whenever you combine pre-pots with endless thirst, which makes, you know, your potions 33% stronger, this essentially is what sometimes it might look like you're not doing damage whatsoever, because it's not that you're not doing damage, it's that they're getting all of that health back. Because what they do is they use a regenerating serum right before the fight start. This thing right here, it lasts 25 seconds and it gives you 400 health plus, you know, a percentage of your health every second. Now think about it. Most of the fights, they don't even last 25 seconds. So if you are fighting against somebody that pre-potted before they started fighting you, most of the damage that you do to them, they're going to get it back. On top of that, this thing gives you stamina back as well. So you can see how big of a disadvantage you can be against somebody that is pre-potting right before the fight. And speaking of pre-potting before the fight, remember how we were talking about arenas and capture the flag with infinite consumables? This is something that every single veteran is doing right before the gates open. So before the gates open, you should be using the best possible attribute food like 48. Then you should be using Desert Sunrise, so these two. Then you're going to be using a powerful honing stone, and right before the gates open, you can either use a fire absorption potion or a void or an ice, depending on what the enemy is using, because the cooldown of all of these things will refresh between rounds, and most of the times the round doesn't even last the full 30 seconds. If they have a lot of elements, then you can use the gemstone. If they have all melees, then you will utilize the old flesh bomb. Now that we talked about borrow power and we talked about the consumables and we talked about the gear, let's go ahead and talk about which I think is possibly the most important thing, and this is going to change based on the build that you're playing, because obviously every build is different. Remember earlier when I was talking about the 50% empowerment that, you know, you have a cap to, and every single veteran wants to reach that 50% or as close as possible? Well, that is going to be finished with the build that you're using, right? So there's two types of damage in New World. Again, please, if I'm confusing any of you guys with any of this, you can always ask me on the comment section down below, or come to the stream and I will be able to give you a further breakdown without, you know, taking much longer in this YouTube video. But anyway, there's two types of damage increase in New World. You have the empowerment. This is the damage increase that it adds on top of everything that you have, right? And this is why they cap it at 50%. Meaning, if you are doing 1,000 damage and you get a 10% in power, now you're doing 1,100, because that 10% in power is just 10% more damage on top of everything you're doing, right? So if everything you're doing brings your damage to 1,000, that 10% empowerment is going to give you 10% more. Now we have the empowerment that it gets to a cap to 50%, and then we have the other type of damages that these are called base damage increase. Now, base damage increase is the damage increase without anything whatsoever, without any attribute puts into the weapon. So if the weapon, whenever you got it, right, without anything on it, deals 500 damage, okay? That is what base damage is talking about. Even though you put 1,000,000 points of damage and stuff, if you get something that increases your base damage by 10%, it's only increasing the 10% of that initial 500 damage, okay? So if with no power whatsoever, you're hitting the enemy with 500, and then you get a 10% base damage increase, you're gonna hit 550, okay? But if you are hitting 1000, remember the base is 500, but if you have your weapon at 1000 damage and you get a 10% base damage increase, you're not gonna increase the damage from 1000 to 1100. You're gonna increase it only from 1000 to 1050. Why? Because base damage only buff the base damage of the weapon without having any, damage added to it. Hopefully I didn't make it too complicated and that was easy enough explanation. Now, what am I saying this? The reason that I'm saying this is because base damage does not have a limit and it does not have a cap. So whenever you see something that it says increases the damage, but it doesn't say in power, and what I'm talking about is I'm gonna show you an example of this. For example, if we go to the Ice Gauntlet right here, you see how this says Ice Gauntlet ability shield target, increasing the ice damage dealt to that target by 25%. That 25% damage increase right there, that is not a 25% in power, meaning that this is not going to be added to that 50% limit. No. This is to the 25% basic damage increase. You can have 1000% of damage increase and it will continue to go up, but you cannot have more than 50%. So don't add the thing that said deals more damage, just add the empowerments. Another thing that is base damage, for example, is this right here. You see, increase the ice storm base damage by 10% for each enemy inside of the storm, maximum 5 targets. So it will increase the damage of the ice storm by a grand total of 50% of its base value, okay? That is very, very important to know because once again, every single build in the game, you want to get close to that 50% in power and then have as much base damage increase as possible. Now, the difference between a base damage increase like this right here, that it says base damage, to an empowered one, it will be something like this right here that it says, when looking at a foe within 14 meters, you move 20% faster and you gain in power, right? Dealing 15% more damage. So essentially that is 15% in power. So if you're using a Great Axe build and you have 35% in power with like either honing stones and maybe like keenly empowered, you know that all you need to have 50% in power with this build is 35%, because whenever you're looking at an enemy, you're gonna get an extra 15%, and that's gonna put you at that 50% sweet spot. Now, not every weapon, unfortunately, can get to 50% in power. A lot of the weapons, they stay around the range of around 30% in power, right? Because, for example, weapons like the Ice Gauntlet, they don't have anything in it that gives them in power, right? So where do they get the empower from? Well, you need to get it from the ring, like ice damage, or you need to get it from the gear right here, another 10% of ice damage. And there you go, right there you got 17% in power for ice damage, and then you use a honing stone, which is another 7%. Now you're sitting at 24% in power for a magical build that doesn't have any empower built into it, right? And then of course you can put keenly empower on that Ice Gauntlet to put it from that 24 to 40%. And again, now you're doing 40% more damage than the enemy. So, and again, that is the last, and borrow power and the build that you're playing, like I said, is the biggest damage incremental in the game. Because just because the gear from 700 to 725 was 15%, I'm going to show you an example on how doing the correct rotation can give you way more than that 15% damage increase that you get from 7 to 7 to 5. So here we are. I just went and I put a sword and shield together real quick, and I came into the Brightwood dummy so I can show you guys the massive difference of damage when you do the right rotation and whenever you combine a bunch of things into the build. And this is why having knowledge about the game is by far the most important thing when it comes to doing damage and mitigating damage. When, like I was talking about earlier, you know, the ability of Upheaval on the sword and shield, like this is already a very good ability. It deals 180% weapon damage. That is a lot of damage. But the thing is, this ability has also other things right here. Upheaval hits target inflicted with crowd control for 20% more. So if the enemy is stunned, rude, or slow, that is 20% more. Then you have things like this. Abilities deal 10% more damage to slow foes. So right, so we're talking about 20% damage increase over here, a 10% damage increase over here. Okay, these are not empowered. This is just damage increase. Remember that base that we were talking about? So let's say that you're sitting about 50% in power with the sword and shield, then all of this damage that I'm telling you about right here, this is all on top of that. And the sword and shield can get to 50% in power super fast, but we're gonna get there in a second. Okay, so 20% increased damage when the enemy is slow, another 10% whenever the enemy is slow. Then if we go to strength over here and we go to 200, 10% damage on stun, slow, or rooted enemies, right? So already by having 200 strength, okay, and putting a point into here and a point into here and slowing the enemy, we're doing 40% more damage with this ability right here, Upheaval. But the thing is, it doesn't stop there. We have things like the Leaping Strike, that the perk over here, it says empowering Leaping Strike. Sword attacks deal 33% more damage if the target is slowed by Leaping Strike, Cowardly Punishment. So if we go back to the sword and shield and we see this here, Cowardly Punishment, so unsuccessful hit, you slow the enemy for 30%, meaning for those 3 seconds you're going to be doing another 33% increased damage, right? So we're talking about 33% increased damage, 10% from 200 strength, so that is 43%. We're talking about another 10% over here. Then we're talking about 20% over here. Then at 10% down here, but I'm not talking about this one because this is a passive that you're gonna have there all the time. You don't even have to slow the enemy, okay? So that is an incredible amount of increase in damage. And if that wasn't enough, with the sword and the shield, if you do a heavy attack, you get a 30% in power. This is the one that it only caps up to 50%, right? So 30% in power from here. So 30% plus this 7%, that is 37%. Plus the honing stone, that already puts you a 50% in power. So if you were to do one heavy attack in the enemy, boom, 50% in power right there, plus all of the other damage increase from the enemy being slow. And I'm gonna show you guys right here how big of a difference is of an Upheaval with and without all of this damage incremental. So I'm gonna get close to the enemy and I'm just gonna hit him with an Upheaval, no empowerments or anything. All right, so here we go. So there we go, we hit the enemy with that Upheaval and it was 5,915. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna do the combo to increase all of our damage. So we're going to use a Leaping Strike for 33% increase. We're gonna use a heavy attack for that 30% empowered, okay? And then we're going to be using the Upheaval. So remember, the first hit was 5,900. Now this hit will look something like this. There you go. 10,752. That was an insane, almost twice as much damage. That was incredible. And as you can see there, by just doing the rotation differently, by just not getting close to the enemy and doing an Upheaval, because that's what we, you know, a lot of new players will do something like that. Instead of just doing that Upheaval like that, think about how can you make that stronger. So let's slow the enemy with either Leaping Strike or Shield Rush, and then let's try to do that heavy attack so we can get that 30% increase. Once again, you know, you can do it any anyway. You can do a heavy attack into a leaping strike, shield rush, upheaval, boom, 10,700. If I were to just do an upheaval, I will be doing about 5,000, like 900 damage. I forgot how much it was. And yes, and that is actually the conclusion of the video. I hope that this wasn't too overwhelming. I really hope it wasn't. And the reason why I made this video is because this is a problem that we have in New World. Every single day, people come into my stream. Trick, I do absolutely no damage. I'm following the build that you put on New World Champ, and I still do absolutely no damage. And again, boys, most of the time, the reason you guys are not doing any damage is not because the enemy has just better gear than you. It's not only they have better gear than you, but they have a better understanding of their build, all right? Remember that the gear different is very little. It's about 15%. There's no way in hell that you're losing every single fight because of 15%. But it's 15% plus the gems, plus the consumables, and then plus the right rotation, wanting to get close to that 50% empowerment. And again, it's not your fault as a new player. This is AGS fault, adding a bunch of, you know, power creeps into the game with different season and not really telling the community or not introducing new players into these power creeps in a natural way. I don't know if I missed anything. If I did, please let me know in the comment section down below. If I confused you somehow, you can drop by the stream at any given time and we can talk about it there. Maybe I can give you a more in-depth explanation. Remember, new player, you guys are not losing because of the gear different. You guys are losing because you have, you know, you have been misguided and you don't have the right information. It's not that you are a bad player. Of course, between the gear and the consumables and all of that, there is a, you know, big chunk of a difference, but the biggest difference comes from knowledge and comes from expertise, knowing how to properly play your build and other things that you need to take in consideration. Who you're fighting against, right? If you're fighting against a spear and they hit you with a skewer, you have to remember that skewer can make you do 50% less damage, because you also have weakens and you have empowerments. Empowerments make you do more damage, but weaken makes you do less damage. So that is also another thing that you need to have in consideration. But once again, this is things that will come with experience the more you play the game. All I ask of you is please read the abilities. That is the most important thing. Read the abilities, every single passive on your skill tree. Read every perk on your gear and understand why you're doing what you're doing and how you're gonna do it, all right? I just said a bunch of things there. Anyways, once again, I hope you guys enjoy this and I hope that this was able to help you guys. And I'll see you guys on the next time. Peace!